Today I'd like to show you how I go about preparing a sermon using my display program. That's the most common use that I have for it. So the first step is to create a folder or directory for your sermon. Now on my hard drive I have a directory called Sermons, and inside that I will now create, let's move it over so that you can actually see what's going on, it's not obscured by the camera. You will actually create a folder, a new folder, and we'll call it Salvation by Faith. That's a good subject, and of course the name lets you see immediately when you want to look for a sermon on that subject later on. You can see what the sermon is all about. So we'll open that directory, move it back over here, and then we start the program just by double clicking on it. Okay, we go to File, we click on New, and up comes the usual filer window. We navigate our way to the new folder we have created, which was, if you remember rightly, Salvation by Faith. There we go. And then we click on Save, and that will save a file called Z3D New File. I give it that name because I like to have my sermon files at the end of the folder. If you would prefer to have them at the beginning, and I can see there are arguments for that, then just delete the Z3D and put in the exclamation mark, and that will ensure that it's right at the very beginning of your folder, whatever else they may be. Okay, now we open up the first slide for editing, and what we're going to do is we're going to insert a tag. So down here, and the first tag is splash. Click on Insert Tag, and there it is. Now we will enter the title of the sermon, which of course is Salvation by Faith, and we'll also put in the name of the church, which we'll imagine is St. Andrew's by the Sea. There's a good title for you, good English title. The splash screen is what is first on screen when your congregation are coming in, when they're settling down in their seats and saying hello to their friends and so on. So it's on screen just to give the basic information of who the preacher is and what the subject is. Before leaving the splash screen, however, I go up to the top of the edit window, where you can see I've just clicked, and you enter, after a space, hyphen, space, NIV, and another space. Now the reason for that is to make the NIV version the default that is used by the program. Without that it would use the KJV as the default, but I prefer the NIV. If you have some other preference, you can enter it here. The only thing is that you must have that particular Bible on your hard drive so that the program can access it. There are full instructions given in the help file. There's no good hoping that the program will go onto the internet and find a Bible for you. It won't. You have to have the Bible on your hard drive. Before clicking Finish, we go up to Tools and click on Auto Advance. Now if you just clicked on Finish, it would simply close down that slide and then sit there. Whereas when you have clicked on Auto Advance, when you click on Finish, it immediately opens up the next slide ready for editing. And the next slide, we'll say, is going to be the scripture reading. We'll leave out the hymns for the moment. So again, we insert a tag. There it is. And what's our scripture reading going to be? Well, let's say John 14, 1, 2, 3. That's a good reference to go with the subject, Salvation by Faith or something. Now, you may wonder about these tags. Why do I keep entering tags? Well, they come in very useful. For example, there's a hymns tag. Now, sometimes I'll turn up at a church, the organist will come up to me and say, what are the hymns today? I can't remember. Maybe 3, there may be 4. Whereas, because the hymns are all marked by the hymns tag, I can just use a couple of key presses and skip through the presentation from hymn 1 to hymn 2 to hymn 3 and so on. And so the organist knows what the hymns are. Of course, if I was well organized, I'd have it written out on a piece of paper for him, perhaps. There you go. So by putting in the tags, for example, the sermon tag, then you can just jump straight to the start of your sermon if you want to miss out everything else. So here we go. Now, I have a number of presets, I suppose you'd call them, one of which I use for my scripture readings. And generally speaking, the pictures, background pictures for these presets are included with the display program. So here is the picture for my scripture reading. And the scripture reading, you remember, was John 14, 1-3. So John 14, 1, and we click on function, and you can see how here the verse has been inserted. Actually, just one verse is a bit, there's not much to it, is there? So we'll put in comma space 2, click on function again, and this time it's much longer. There's the verse, and we'll put in a title for it, Trust in God. Okay, and there we have it. Now you can alter these presets, change the background picture, change the font sizes and so on. I would recommend that at least at first, until you know exactly what you're doing, you stick with the presets that I've given you. And I would also suggest that whatever else you do, you keep the font sizes. I'm sure we've all seen people who are doing a wonderful PowerPoint presentation, and the screen is full of text in tiny little writing. Even when you're sat at the front of the church, you have trouble reading it. People at the back haven't a hope. Whereas this font size that I'm using here can be seen, given a decent-sized picture, decent-sized projected picture, can be seen even by those at the back of the church. All right, now you've got there two verses, verses 1 and 2. You may, if you wish, go from verse 1 to verse 3. Let's click function again and show what that looks like, and you'll notice that in between verses 1 and 3 there is an ellipsis, 3 dots, to indicate that one or more verses have been omitted, which I think is only honest. Okay, however, let's go back to verses 1 and 2. There you are. So there's the first part of our scripture reading. We click on finish. We go back to the default, the preset, Trust in God, and John 14:3. Incidentally, you will have to use the format that the program expects if you want this automatic insertion to work. I know some people like to put a comma between the chapter and the verse, or a semicolon or something. You can go back and alter that if you like for display on the screen, but for use, the automatic insertion, you will have to follow the format that I think is pretty standard, of a colon between the chapter and verse and a comma and a space between verses. Okay, so 1:3, there it is, justify. Now, when you come to the final verse of the scripture reading, I like to insert a marker, which in this case is the hymn end marker. There it is. And that alerts, usually you'll know what your scripture reading is, but if someone else is reading it for you, the church elder or a child from the congregation or something, they will know that that is the end of the scripture reading. And, okay. Incidentally, you'll notice that there are a number of codes that are used in the slide definition. And I've had people say to me, why do you use codes, all those codes? PowerPoint doesn't. It does. But you can't see them. And that's a nuisance, because what you can't see, you can't edit. I don't know whether you've ever had it happen that you start a paragraph with the numeral 1 for whatever reason. And then you go to your next paragraph, press return to get to your next paragraph, and the program assumes that you're in a list and it starts off with 2. You don't want a 2. I can't find a way to easily get out of this list business except by going back to the first one, deleting the 1, which is a nuisance, but there you go. It's one of the reasons I don't use PowerPoint. There we go. All right, so we'll finish that. Now, our next slide, we will put in, it's the children's story. But that's all I'm going to do. We'll move on immediately, and you'll see why I'm skipping over anything else towards the end of this little presentation. We'll now go to the sermon, and we'll use the sermon tag. You'll notice that the third line consists of an upright symbol and an asterisk. The asterisk is to tell the program that it should set the elapsed time clock to 0. So you can glance at your presenter screen and see immediately how long you've been boring the pants off your congregation. Okay, now we'll change the title, which, as you know, is Salvation by Faith. And there it is. Now, we'll start off with a picture. There are two ways of putting in the picture. One is to click here where it says Picture, and then type in the picture name. But the simplest method is to have the picture in your sermon directory. There you go. And then just drag it in. And it's there immediately ready for editing. Before moving on, insert your notes. Now, I first started putting notes in my sermons because I became aware that, looking up from the projector to the screen and then to my congregation and back again, and I was losing my place in my paper notes and having to stand there for a moment looking through to see where I was. And of course I remember a young minister of my acquaintance many years ago. He always used to write his sermon notes on 5x3 file cards, which was fine. It all worked fine. He'd just move the card to the back when he'd finished with it, until the day he stumbled going up into the pulpit and dropped his cards, a dozen cards or so. And of course, sod's law, that would be the day that he hadn't numbered the cards. Yes, well, there we go. So having your sermon notes on the presenter screen is useful because you know exactly what you should be saying for that particular slide. But I found another reason for them. You can make it so the notes appear on screen, the screen that the congregation is seeing. I introduced this feature when I turned up at one church and discovered that a member of the congregation, a young man, was profoundly deaf. And even with hearing aids, he couldn't hear what I was saying. So, fair play to him. He'd come along every week, but he'd just sit there in a pew reading a book or reading his Bible or something. So by putting the sermon notes on screen, he was able to follow what the sermon was all about and feel much more involved in the church service. And would you believe it, after doing this a few times, I had some of the old dears in the congregation come up to me. They hadn't been able to put their hearing aids in properly that morning, or the batteries were running down, or they hadn't been able to switch it to T. And they said how much they appreciated having the notes on screen, because then they could see what was being said, and that enabled them to guess at what I was saying much more accurately. And then, of course, along came the pandemic, and having to preach over Zoom. Now, Zoom appears to favor video over audio, so you can have a perfectly rock-steady picture while the audio is breaking up something horrible. But because the notes are on screen, people are able to read, and therefore even if they can't hear properly what I'm saying because of limited bandwidth or something, they at least know what the sermon is all about. So we'll put in some notes here. And they should be fairly full so that they make a connected series for your audience to follow. When Jesus comes again, we must be saved by faith to be ready to meet him. Okay. Now, you'll notice that the Notes button has changed to Private Notes. We'll click on that, and you can see that down here there's some more notes. There are a number of uses for the private notes. They will appear on the presenter screen. If there are private notes, they'll appear on the presenter screen in preference to the ordinary notes. You may want to insert something that only you can see. For example, if I have notes in a foreign language, I want to know what's being said, so I have the private notes in English. And then I can look at the presenter screen, see what I should be saying, but the audience is seeing in the foreign language, whatever it may be. Or it might be that there is a word that I'm not particularly familiar with, imputed, for example. Do you know what that is in Welsh or Spanish or something? You're not particularly familiar with it, but you don't want to broadcast to the congregation that it's a term you don't come across very often in everyday conversation. So I put in brackets the meaning of the word in the private notes, and it's there for me to see, and the congregation remains in happy ignorance of my ignorance. So I'll just put down here, these are some private notes that only I can see. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. Now, of course, you don't have to have all your pictures in the sermon directory. You can drag them in from elsewhere, as I'm going to do just now. The only thing is that the program will work out where the slide has come from, provided it is on the same hard drive. It won't work if it's on a different hard drive. And the other thing you must be aware of is that if you are preparing your sermon on your desktop, but you're going to be presenting it with a laptop, you must make sure that the laptop has the same folders and directories in the same locations on your laptop. It's no good dragging in a file from a picture from the holiday pics folder if the laptop doesn't have a holiday pics folder. Well, it just won't be, it won't work. So we'll put in some notes here. Jesus came for the first time as a baby in Bethlehem. Okay. You might also, of course, have a scripture passage. What would be a good passage? Well, John 3:16. Click there. God's love. Justify. There you go. And so you can go on creating your sermon. We'll leave it at that. And we'll put in our final tag, which is for the benediction. All right, so far so good. Let's go back. Or before we stop, we'll go to Tools and switch off the Auto Advance, otherwise we'll find ourselves presented with a slide we don't want. Let's go back to the children's story. Now, I have on in my sermons directory a folder that is just children's stories. So you open up the story that you want, you find the text file for that story. It was created just using the display program, and you drag it in. You set the red box to children's story, or to wherever it is you want the file inserted. You drag it in, and there you go. Now, you may need to edit it a little bit. You'll see there's a couple of blank slides there that we don't want, so we'll remove them. And there is your children's story. Now, you can use this facility of dragging in a file for all sorts of things. For example, I have a bits folder. And if I turn up at a church and the elder says, in this church we use the Lord's Prayer, well, I just drag in the appropriate bit and the necessary commands are issued to the program. All right, so let's have a look at our finished program. Here we go. There is the splash screen, the scripture reading with the verses, the children's story, and there it is. Complete video, which we won't bother looking at. The sermon. Now, you'll remember that for this slide we had the notes. There they are, visible at the bottom of the screen. And if we go to where we can see the presenter screen, there are the private notes. The private notes are in blue. When there's just ordinary notes there, it's got a white background. All right, so we'll go back to the main screen, And that is how you prepare a sermon using my display program. It's all very simple, and it does save a lot of time. God bless.